My parents said a woman shouldn't study and should just marry a rich man, but I ignored them and went to college. Now they're begging for my help. My mother called me selfish over a pan of burnt dinner rolls, which honestly tracks for my family. That was years after the biggest fights. Years after I had my own apartment and my own bills and a job title that made people straighten up a little when I said it out loud. But the sound of her voice still had this creepy ability to drag me straight back to being 15 and standing in a kitchen with a patched school skirt, while my younger brother showed off new expensive sneakers like he had personally discovered money. My name is Marisol, and if you met me now, you would probably think I'm one of those women who has it together. I manage operations for a mid-sized company, I pay my rent on time, I keep extra batteries and cold medicine in a drawer like a proper adult, and I own exactly 3 plants that are somehow still alive. I sound calm on conference calls. I make color-coded spreadsheets for fun when I'm angry. I look, from a distance, like a person who came from stable people. I did not. My father used to be a history teacher at a public high school in our mid-sized Pennsylvania town, which sounds like it should come with wisdom and fairness and maybe a love of facts. In our house, it mostly came with lectures. My mother ran a tiny clothing shop on a tired street where half the stores changed hands every year, and the other half survived by pretending they were doing better than they were. My brother was 4 years younger than me and raised like he was a fragile prince in a family that somehow only had enough softness for one child. I was the practical one, the independent one, which in my family was not a compliment. It was code for, we're not doing that for you, figure it out. There are so many little memories that by themselves sound stupid. Tiny things. Petty things. The kind of details people tell you to let go because everybody's parents mess up. But when you stack them together, they form a whole building. At 15, I wore hand-me-down uniforms my mother adjusted with crooked stitching, while my brother got new shoes because boys apparently needed proper support for their growing feet. On birthdays, I got a cake from the grocery store with my name spelled right if the person behind the counter was having a good day. My brother got themed parties, matching plates, and my mother breathlessly asking if the balloons looked cheap. When my grandparents came over from my father's side, my grandmother would watch all this with her mouth pressed thin, like she knew exactly what was happening and hated it, but she almost never confronted my parents directly. She'd slip me $20 in the bathroom and tell me to buy myself something nice. My grandfather would ask about school too loudly, almost like he wanted to force my parents to acknowledge I existed. That was the most rebellion anyone managed. In high school, I got good grades because being useful was the only reliable way to get oxygen in that house. I stayed out of trouble, joined clubs that met after school, and learned very early that if I wanted praise, I had to earn it in private and then clap for myself later. My brother, meanwhile, got treated like his potential was some sacred national resource. My father paid for a test prep program for him when he was barely even interested in school yet, saying boys needed a strong push to launch right. My mother used to sigh at me and say things like, "You've always been so capable. Honey, you don't need all that hand-holding," which sounds nice until you realize it was always said right before they handed him something they would never even consider giving me. And look, I was not some saintly daughter floating above all this with graceful maturity. I rolled my eyes, I slammed cabinets. I said mean things under my breath. I was sarcastic in exactly the way adults hate from teenage girls because it forces them to hear themselves. I knew I was angry all the time, and I also knew anger made it easier for them to label me difficult. So I started doing that fun little thing girls do where they swallow half of what they want to say and then get called emotional anyway. By the time I was a senior, I was running on caffeine, resentment, and this very private fantasy that college would fix my life. Not in a movie way. I didn't think I'd go away and become some glowing new person under autumn leaves. I just thought maybe I could get out. Maybe I could get a degree, get a job with health insurance and a door that locked, and build a life where I wasn't always bracing for the next comment. I got accepted to a state university for business administration, and I remember printing the acceptance letter in the school library because I wanted to hold it in my hand before anybody at home had a chance to ruin it. I folded it into my backpack like it was a winning lottery ticket. That dinner after graduation is still one of those scenes I can replay down to the smell. Pot roast. Too much black pepper. My mother had lit the good candle because there was company coming the next day, and she liked pretending we were a family that used candles for dinner instead of power outages. I was excited in that raw, shaky way where your body is already preparing for impact, but your hope hasn't gotten the memo yet. I waited until plates were half empty, and then said I got in. Not just got in. Got into the program I wanted. I had looked into financial aid. I could work. I had a plan. My father put his fork down so hard it hit the plate with that sharp ceramic crack, and I knew before he even opened his mouth that whatever came next was not going to be congratulations. He stared at me like I had announced I was joining a circus. My mother smiled first, which somehow made it worse, because it was her soft, public smile, the one she used right before she said something cruel, in a voice sweet enough to make you question your own hearing. My father asked how exactly I expected to pay for 4 years of tuition. I said I had looked at aid packages, loans, maybe work study, maybe a job off campus if I had to. I had practiced this. I had pamphlets in my room. I was ready for concern. I was not ready for contempt. He said college debt was for fools and families with no pride. He said taking loans was basically begging with paperwork. Then he looked at my mother like he wanted an audience. And he said there was no point mortgaging our future so I could waste 4 years on a degree I would probably abandon the second I got married. Just like that. No build-up, no embarrassment, just a nice clean slice right through the middle of dinner. My mother reached across the table and touched my wrist with this fake tenderness that made me want to pull my skin off. She said very smart women scared off good men, and maybe I should think about what kind of life I really wanted. She said stability came from choosing wisely, not chasing every idea that crossed my mind. Then my father said the money they had managed to save would be reserved for my brother because a man needs a launch. A launch. Like I was a hobby and he was a mission. My brother sat there eating dessert while my future got discussed like an annoying expense. He didn't defend me. He didn't look uncomfortable. He just kept spooning whipped topping into his mouth and acting like this had nothing to do with him, which in some ways was worse than if he had smirked. If he had smirked, at least I could have hated him cleanly. Instead, he gave me that blank little boy expression he used whenever he didn't want responsibility near him. The one that said, "What do you want me to do about it?" I said I could take loans myself. My father snapped that nobody in his family was going to go around asking strangers to finance bad judgment. I said it wasn't asking strangers, it was literally how half the country paid for college. He raised his voice. My mother started crying on cue, saying I always had to make things dramatic, that I was trying to embarrass them, that I made every happy moment feel like an attack. That was her specialty, by the way. Take my pain, drape it over herself, and suddenly I was the villain for bleeding in her vicinity. I wish I could say I delivered some beautiful speech and walked away glowing with self-respect. I didn't. I cried. I said things that came out in gasps and fragments. I asked why it was always different for him. I asked what exactly they had ever sacrificed for me besides opportunities. My father told me if I didn't like the rules, I knew where the door was, so there it was. A family classic. Be grateful or leave. The next week, I applied for every scholarship I could find, took the first administrative assistant job that would hire me full-time, and enrolled anyway. Nobody helped me move. Nobody asked how I was going to do classes at night after working all day. My mother told 2 relatives I was being stubborn and wanted to prove some point. She said it the way people describe a child refusing to wear a coat. My father stopped bringing up school entirely, which in our house was how punishment worked. Silence instead of screaming. Dismissal instead of support. It made me feel like a ghost who still had chores. The first 4 years after that were ugly, if I'm being honest. Not inspiring. Not character building in the cute way people say when they mean, wow, glad that wasn't me. I worked from 8 to 5 in an office where the copier jammed every other day, and the fluorescent lights made everyone look like they were being medically drained. Then I drove straight to campus for classes that started in the evening and often ran until close to midnight. On weekends, I picked up extra shifts wherever I could. Filing, front desk work, inventory help, anything that paid. I lived on cheap sandwiches, vending machine coffee, and the kind of exhaustion that makes you cry because somebody drops a spoon. One night, I passed out in the library, just fully dropped. A girl from one of my classes shook me awake and kept asking if I was diabetic. I wasn't. I was broke and tired and trying to prove I deserved the space I was taking up in the world. I laughed when the campus nurse asked if I had a support system. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because I didn't know how else to answer without sounding pathetic. Meanwhile, my brother did 2 years at a local community college with everything covered by my parents, decided it wasn't for him, quit, and got a sales job through one of my father's connections. It wasn't some glamorous thing, despite the way he later told it. He sold entry-level properties for a regional company and acted like he was closing skyscrapers in a power suit. At family gatherings, my mother would say he was so naturally gifted with people. About me, if anyone asked, she said I was busy. Just busy. As if I had become a weather pattern instead of a daughter. I kept going anyway. I graduated, then I got promoted, then again. Supervisor, coordinator, manager. Every step up felt good for about 10 minutes before the old ache came back, because achievements are weird when the people who should have celebrated you seem irritated you pulled them off without permission. By then, I was making more money than anyone else in my family, which sounds satisfying, and sometimes it was. But mostly it made them quiet around me in this brittle way that said they resented needing to update the story they told about me. I finally rented my own one-bedroom apartment a few years before I'd end up cutting my family off completely. It wasn't fancy. It had beige carpet that looked permanently worried, one bathroom with weird piping noises, and a narrow kitchen where opening the oven made it impossible to open the fridge. I loved it like people love things they bled for. Every fork in that drawer was mine, every stupid lamp. I had spent years sharing walls, sharing bathrooms, sharing air with people who treated me like I was temporary. So having a place where I could sit in silence and know nobody was about to barge in felt borderline spiritual. Not in a poetic way. More in a, wow, I can eat cereal in my underwear and nobody gets to comment kind of way. That winter I made the mistake of thinking maybe hosting a family holiday dinner could reset something. I know. People hear this part and ask why I keep giving them chances. The answer is embarrassing and simple. Because every now and then toxic families cough up one good afternoon and you start acting like maybe the last 20 years were a misunderstanding. Also, I wanted to prove something. To them, yes, but mostly to myself. I wanted to see everyone sitting in my living room eating food I paid for and feel like I had crossed some invisible line into adulthood they could not take from me. My brother arrived late with his girlfriend, who came from money in that effortless way that makes regular people feel sticky just standing near it. She was not rude right away. That would have been easier. She was cheerful, complimentary even. She said my apartment was so charming with this little pause before charming that carried a whole paragraph. She kept mentioning her parents' property without seeming to notice she was doing it, which is honestly a talent. Their guest house, their summer place, the closet in her old room. My brother soaked it up like a man getting artificial sunlight. During dinner, he started making jokes. Small ones at first, about how compact the place was, about how his girlfriend's family probably had a walk-in closet bigger than my bedroom. Then he looked around my bathroom when he came back from washing his hands and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that the whole thing could fit inside her mother's dressing room. He laughed like he had delivered a line on stage. His girlfriend did this tiny, uncomfortable laugh, which somehow made it more humiliating, because now I had to witness a stranger realizing my family was like this in real time. My mother giggled nervously and told me not to be sensitive. My father didn't say much, but there was a half smile there, the same one he used when he thought somebody else was teaching me a lesson he approved of. I kept serving food because if I had stopped moving, I might have thrown the mashed potatoes at his head. Then my brother asked if that was all there was. Nothing better? He said, glancing at the dishes like I had put out prison rations. He added that his girlfriend was used to a different standard. In my own apartment, eating a dinner I had cooked after working all week. Something in me just snapped clean in half, not dramatically, more like a wire burning out behind the wall. I put the serving spoon down and said, very calmly at first, that unlike him, I paid for the roof over my head myself. I said that if he wanted to compare lifestyles, maybe he should start with one he had actually earned. I pointed out that he was nearly 30, still living with our parents and walking around like proximity to his girlfriend's family wealth somehow counted as achievement. He went red so fast it almost impressed me. Then it got ugly. He called me jealous, a failure, bitter, said I had always hated seeing him happy, which would have been a stronger point if he had not been actively insulting me in my home while chewing food I made. My father banged his hand on the table and ordered me to apologize immediately, to my brother and to the girlfriend, because I was embarrassing the family. My mother started crying and saying I had ruined the holiday, that I always ruined everything with my temper, that I couldn't just let one little joke go. One little joke. Funny how the joke is always small when it's at my expense and huge when I answer back. I walked to the front door, opened it, and said everybody needed to leave. I said it cold because if I had let myself get emotional, they would have used it as proof I was unstable. My mother stared at me like I had slapped her. My father told me not to be ridiculous. My brother stood up and knocked his chair back and called me pathetic. I repeated myself, out, now. They went, but not quietly. My mother did the wounded martyr thing all the way down the hall. My father said I would regret this. My brother turned in the parking lot and yelled that I was going to die alone because nobody could stand being around me for long. I can still hear the shape of it, if not every exact word. You know how some sentences stick to your bones because they sound suspiciously like the thing you already fear about yourself? Yeah, that. After I locked the door, I sat on the kitchen floor in front of the dishwasher and cried so hard I gave myself a headache. Then, because humiliation and practicality are roommates, I got up and put the leftovers away. I blocked my brother that night. I didn't talk to him for 5 years. The silence with my parents after that was messy and fake. They would call occasionally, always pretending the main problem was my stubbornness. Never the favoritism. Never the insults. Never the way they had laughed along while he humiliated me. A few relatives started repeating that I had always been difficult, which was a line so obviously fed to them by my mother that I almost admired the consistency. I skipped holidays where my brother might be there. I made excuses. Work, headaches, deadlines, bad weather, whatever I needed. My grandparents still saw me. My grandmother would squeeze my hand and say I had done the right thing, though even she stopped short of telling my parents off directly. Family systems are amazing that way. Everybody sees it. Nobody wants the smoke. Over those 5 years, my life got steadier from the outside. Better apartment, better salary, health insurance that covered therapy, which was rude timing because by then I had enough issues to keep a therapist employed forever. I dated a little, nothing dramatic. Mostly men who liked that I seemed independent until they realized independence sometimes looks like difficulty letting anybody help you carry groceries. I worked too much. I slept with my phone under my pillow when quarterly reporting got bad. I told myself I was over my family. Then my grandmother called one spring afternoon and told me my brother was engaged to the same girlfriend from that dinner, and the whole old ache sat up inside me like it had been napping. Not dead. Apparently the wedding was going to be big. Bigger than big, actually. My brother had spent years orbiting that family and absorbing their standards like humidity, and now that he was getting married, he wanted every possible surface polished to prove he belonged in their world. Fancy venue, see? Imported flowers. A menu nobody in our family would have known how to pronounce without rehearsal. My parents, who should have had the sense to sit down and count their actual dollars before opening their mouths, promised publicly that they would cover the venue and the decor. Publicly. In front of people who absolutely did not need to know their finances, but definitely needed to know their pride. That part came to me in pieces through my grandparents and one aunt who still occasionally spoke to me without making it weird. My parents were obsessed with not looking small next to the future in-laws. My mother was apparently talking about centerpieces like she was producing a state wedding. My father was acting like this was an investment in family respectability. Family respectability. We could not even survive one honest dinner, but sure, let's perform class status for strangers. Then reality did what reality always does when you build a fantasy on top of a checking account. They finally sat down with actual estimates and realized the event was going to cost almost 3 times what they had available, and the wedding was only a few months away. I heard all that before they showed up at my apartment, which made the whole visit feel like a thunderstorm you smell before you see. They came without calling. That alone was enough to put me in a bad mood. My mother had one of those tight little smiles that meant she needed something and had already decided I was selfish for not offering it fast enough. My father looked annoyed to be there, which was incredible considering he was the one arriving at my home empty-handed to ask for money. I let them in because curiosity is a character flaw of mine. They sat in the same living room my brother had mocked years earlier, and for one vicious second I wondered if either of them noticed that nothing in here looked cheap. Not because I was rich, because I had spent years learning how to buy carefully and stretch a dollar without making my life look sad. My father cleared his throat and explained they needed a substantial loan. He said loan like he was discussing a respectable business arrangement between equals, not asking the daughter he had once practically called shameless for considering student debt. My mother started crying before he got halfway through the explanation. She talked about humiliation, about appearances, about how devastating it would be if the groom's side could not uphold what had been promised. She said I didn't understand how important this was for the family, which is wild because the family had spent most of my life making it very clear I was not central enough to matter when it counted. I let them finish. I really did. Then I asked if loans were still pathetic and shameful, or if that moral principle had expired when the bill involved imported flowers. The look on my father's face was almost worth the whole miserable childhood. He said this was different. Of course it was. It was about family honor. Not a wasteful degree. Not personal ambition. Not pride. Family honor. I asked whether one day of fancy table settings was genuinely more important than the education that let me build the life they were currently trying to borrow from. My mother cried harder and said, "After everything we've done for you." I asked her, very calmly, to name one thing. Just one. The room went so quiet I could hear my refrigerator humming. She stared at me like I had violated some sacred code by asking for evidence. My father told me I was being cruel for the sake of it. I told him no, I was being specific, which our family often confused with cruelty, because facts had a bad habit of ruining their preferred storyline. Then I said no, not maybe, not let me think about it. No. He stood up so fast I thought for a second he might actually knock something over. He said I was petty, vindictive, and eager to punish everyone forever over old misunderstandings. Old misunderstandings. That phrase made me laugh in his face. Laugh. My mother did the martyr glance around the room like the walls themselves might witness her suffering and report it later. They left angry, not ashamed, not thoughtful. Angry. 2 days later, my phone started blowing up. Aunt, cousin, other cousin. An uncle I hadn't seen in ages suddenly remembered I existed long enough to text me that money had gone to my head. A relative I barely knew left a voicemail saying my parents had sacrificed so much and I was cold-hearted for abandoning them in their hour of need. My mother had clearly gone on tour with a revised version of events where I was the rich, ungrateful daughter refusing to help the loving parents who had done everything for me. Nobody mentioned that I had paid my own way through college. Nobody mentioned the years of sexist garbage. Nobody mentioned that the wedding they couldn't afford was for the son they had always prioritized. I blocked numbers until my thumb hurt. But before I blocked them, I read enough to do that awful thing where the gaslighting starts working because it comes in chorus form. A small part of me wondered if I was being too hard. Whether I should just wire the money and buy myself peace. Whether maybe this was one of those moments mature adults swallow their pride and do the decent thing. Then I remembered falling asleep over textbooks with a sandwich in my lap while my brother lived at home with his expenses covered. And the guilt dried right up. I cut contact with my parents after that. Full stop. No calls, no texts, no holiday cards with fake signatures. Nothing. I was done being the emergency backup fund for people who had treated my future like an inconvenience. Silence would have been nice. Silence did not happen. About a week later, there was pounding at my apartment door hard enough to rattle the frame. I opened it and found my father standing there already halfway into a rage, my mother right behind him with her purse clutched to her chest like she was about to testify in church. Before I could say anything, he pushed past me into the apartment without being invited. That old move. The one from childhood where my space was never really mine if he had decided otherwise. I told him he needed to leave. He ignored me. He launched straight into this speech about how I had destroyed the relationship between my parents and their son. Their son. Not my brother, not our family. Their son. He said when they told him they couldn't cover everything they had promised, he panicked, felt humiliated, and turned on them. Apparently, he had yelled that they made him look ridiculous in front of his future in-law. Apparently, my mother cried. My father shouted back. And the whole thing exploded in the dramatic trash fire you would expect when a lifetime of enabling finally stops paying off. Then came the part that was somehow supposed to land on me. My father said if I had just helped, none of that would have happened, that I had caused this out of spite, that my refusal had poisoned the family and left them exposed. My mother started sobbing and said they had lost the only son who still cared, which was a nasty little sentence even by our standards. Then she corrected herself in the most insulting way possible by saying she didn't mean it like that. Sure. I told them what I honestly believed, that they had created this exact disaster by building my brother into a man who thought promises were facts and consequences were other people's problem. I said he reacted the way he did because nobody had ever taught him disappointment without rescue. I said this was not my bill, emotionally or financially. My father's face changed when I said that. It got colder, less furious. More dangerous in that ordinary domestic way where you know the yelling phase is over and the cruelty phase has started. He said I had always enjoyed acting superior, that I thought paying my own way made me better than the family that raised me. I said no, I thought paying my own way meant I didn't owe them a performance of gratitude every time they needed something. My mother told me I was heartless. I told her being done wasn't the same as being heartless. She cried harder. Of course she did. Tears were her smoke machine. They came out whenever she needed to blur the stage. The argument lasted maybe 10 minutes, maybe 30. Hard to say. Time gets weird when your nervous system is trying to decide whether to scream or freeze. At one point, my father jabbed a finger toward me and said I would pay for tearing the family apart. He did not mean physically, before anybody gets dramatic. He meant socially, emotionally, through reputation, through the old family network of whispers and rewrites and moral theater. Still, hearing your own father say you'll pay for telling the truth does something gross to your insides. After they left, I locked the door, slid down against it, and started shaking so hard I could barely text my grandmother. She called me immediately and told me if they showed up again, I should not open the door. She also said, very flatly, that my father had always confused obedience with love. It was one of the only blunt things she ever said about him, and I held on to it like a receipt. 3 weeks passed. I started sleeping again. Work got busy enough to distract me. I told myself maybe the worst of it was over. Then my brother showed up. I opened the door and almost shut it again on instinct. He looked different. Not transformed. Not humbled by divine intervention. Just tired. His posture was off. His face looked puffy around the eyes, like either he had been sleeping badly or fighting a lot, maybe both. He asked if he could come in. I said no. He asked if we could at least talk in the hallway. So we did, which probably made my neighbors think I was dealing with a very awkward door-to-door salesman. He started with an apology. Not a perfect one. An organized one. He said he had handled things badly at the holiday dinner years ago. He admitted he had been arrogant and immature. He said our parents had set both of us up in different ways and that he was trying to understand that now. Some of it sounded rehearsed. Some of it sounded almost real. I stood there in socks on my own doormat trying to decide whether I was witnessing growth or strategy. Then, right on schedule, he got to the actual reason he was there. He needed help. A loan. Temporary. He had ideas, of course. A repayment plan. Interest even, as if adding a tiny business school flourish would make the whole thing less insulting. He said he wanted to fix things between us, but he also didn't want one financial crisis to ruin his future. His future. That phrase again. Everybody in my family always talked like my life was the background music for somebody else's big scene. I said I needed time to think. I didn't mean it. I just wanted to see what would happen if he did not get an immediate answer. And wow, did I get my answer? His face hardened almost instantly. The careful tone dropped. He said he was trying here, that he was being the bigger person by coming to me after everything. Bigger person. By asking the sister he had mocked and dismissed to bankroll the wedding he couldn't afford. I asked if he heard himself. He said I loved holding old grudges because they made me feel righteous. I said I loved not being used, actually. Easier hobby. That's when he started yelling. He said I had always been jealous of him. Since childhood. Since forever. That I couldn't stand seeing him happy, loved, successful. Successful was an especially funny word given the circumstances, but I was too angry to laugh. He was standing in my hallway, half turned toward the stairs, gesturing with both hands like a man pitching a startup nobody asked for, and he really expected me to believe I was the unstable one in that scenario. I told him the truth the way ugly truths usually come out, which is fast and without much elegance. I said he was exactly like our parents in all the worst ways, entitled, manipulative, allergic to responsibility unless it came wrapped in praise. I said he hadn't shown up because he felt bad. He had shown up because he needed money and thought an apology would function as a coupon. He flinched at that, which told me it landed. Instead of backing off, he stepped closer. Not lunging. Not anything cinematic. Just that ordinary aggressive move people do when they want to make you feel crowded in your own space. I told him to get out. He said we were having an adult conversation and I was behaving like a spoiled child. Spoiled. Me. I actually laughed then, and that made him even madder. When I moved to shut the door, he put his hand on the edge of it. Again, not movie stuff. No smashed frames or wrestling in the hallway. Just enough pressure to say, you don't get to end this yet. My body reacted before my brain did. Every nerve I owned lit up. I shoved his shoulder once and yelled for him to leave. He kept talking over me. So I did the one thing I knew would embarrass him more than anything else. I raised my voice and shouted down the hall for the building manager and said I would call the police if he didn't get away from my door. That changed things. It was like somebody let the air out of him. He took his hand off the door immediately, partly because he was startled, partly because the thought of neighbors hearing the word police was apparently more horrifying than his own behavior. He backed up and called me toxic, said he would tell everybody what I was really like. I said, please do, which was not my wisest line, but definitely one of my favorites. Then I shut the door, locked it, and stood there shaking so hard I had to lean on the wall. I wish I could tell you I felt triumphant. I didn't. I felt furious, sick, weirdly sad, and embarrassed all at once. Family fights are gross like that. Even when you know you're right, there's still this little voice whispering, look at you, screaming in a hallway like this is your life now. I cried in the shower. Then I got mad at myself for crying. Then I ordered takeout. I couldn't really justify financially because I was too drained to cook. Real glamour. For a couple of weeks after that, I jumped every time someone knocked on my door. I checked the peephole like I lived in a spy movie, which I absolutely did not. I told my manager I needed a day off because of a family situation. And she gave me the kind of look women give each other when we all know that phrase means disaster without needing subtitles. I spent one Saturday deep cleaning my apartment with aggressive music on just to burn off adrenaline. I threw out expired spices. I reorganized the junk drawer. I found a receipt from 3 years earlier and cried over that too, because apparently my nervous system had decided absolutely anything could be a trigger if it tried hard enough. Then, 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived in the mail with my name written in my mother's familiar looping handwriting. It was a wedding invitation. I actually thought it might be a joke at first. Or bait. Or one of those manipulative gestures where somebody invites you only so they can later say, "See, we included you," and then blame you for not showing. I left it on my counter for 3 days before opening it properly. Cream paper, formal wording, my brother's name, the date. A venue I had heard of but would never book even if I suddenly won the lottery and lost all sense. My grandparents called that evening and mentioned they had gotten invitations too. My grandmother said the whole thing felt strange. My grandfather, who never wasted words, said, "Something shifted." That sentence sat with me. Because he was right. Something had shifted. I just didn't know in whose favor. I stared at the invitation for another day, then finally called my brother. He answered on the third ring, sounding cautious, like he expected me to scream. I didn't. I asked if the invitation was real. He said yes. I asked why. Long pause. Like, long enough that I pulled the phone away to check if the call had dropped. Finally, he said he had meant some of the apology. Not all of it in the clean, noble way I might have wanted, but enough that he had wanted to fix things before the wedding. Then he panicked about money and ruined whatever sincerity had existed. He said after our fight, he ended up telling his fiancée more of the truth than he ever had before. Not because he woke up enlightened. Exactly. More because he had run out of ways to explain the chaos without exposing where it came from. He told her about the favoritism, about my college, about the holiday dinner, about our parents, about all of it. I stood there in my kitchen barefoot, gripping the edge of the counter, while he quietly admitted that she had been disgusted. Not by me, by him. Once he started talking, it all came out in this awkward, halting stream that sounded way less like redemption and way more like somebody finally cornered by his own lies. He said his fiancée had already noticed things not adding up. Different stories from different relatives. My mother making herself sound heroic in ways that apparently raised even her eyebrows. One aunt, after 2 glasses of wine at some pre-wedding event, had filled in several missing pieces with the bluntness only extended family can deliver. Not because she was brave, probably. More because she likes drama and happened to be holding it at the right angle. According to him, his fiancée was furious that he had hidden the real family dynamic from her. Furious that he had let her believe I was just cold and difficult when the truth was uglier and much more ordinary. She confronted him about the way he had benefited from everything without ever naming it. About the way he had repeated our parents' treatment of me because it kept his life easier. She apparently said, and I cherish this line, that adulthood was a terrible time to discover the man you planned to marry still needed a moral babysitter. I asked what that had to do with the invitation. He said she had agreed to cover the remaining wedding costs through her family, but with conditions. He had to stop lying. He had to make amends where he could. He had to tell the truth about what had happened, not spin it. Not soften it into misunderstandings. Say it plain. Which, honestly, sounded less like romance and more like a probation plan. But maybe that's what he needed. Then he told me something I truly did not expect. My parents had never actually been banned from the wedding. During the huge fight about money, they were the ones who had declared they were clearly not wanted and stormed out in full tragic parent mode. He had tried later to tell them they were still invited. Multiple times, apparently, but by then they had committed to the narrative where they had been rejected by their ungrateful son after sacrificing everything. It fit too nicely with their self-image to give up. So instead, they told people they had been pushed out and let the sympathy roll in. The whole thing made me sick in that tired way where you're not shocked, just exhausted by how predictable it all is once someone finally says it out loud. I asked if he expected me to forgive him because his fiancée made him do homework. He said no. At least not immediately. He said he just wanted me to know I had not imagined any of it. Which sounds like a small thing, but if you grow up in a house where reality gets rewritten every time your feelings inconvenience someone, hearing the other person admit the truth matters in a gross, painful way. I did not melt. I did not say, "Oh my God, family is family, let's heal." Absolutely not. I told him I was glad he had finally noticed the house was on fire, but I had been coughing on smoke for years. He went quiet. Then he said he knew. That was maybe the most honest part of the whole conversation. because he did not dress it up. He just knew. We ended the call without a grand moment. No tears. No promise to start over. Just a weird, uncomfortable truce where two damaged adults recognized they had survived the same parents from different positions in the blast radius. I spent the next few days arguing with myself about whether to go. One minute, I thought absolutely not. Why would I volunteer for a room full of old humiliation and expensive chairs? The next minute, I thought maybe showing up on my own terms would matter to me more than to him. My therapist, who by then knew my family tree like a cursed map, asked what choice would let me sleep best afterward. I hated that question because it was good. Then my brother called again. He sounded almost embarrassed, asking, which I appreciated. He said if I did come, would I be willing to stand with him for part of the ceremony prep? Because our parents were still refusing contact and the whole thing felt ugly. He did not frame it as me saving him. More like, I don't know how to do this and I'm asking. There is a difference. Tiny, but real. I said I would think about that too. In the end, I went. Not because I forgave him. Not because I believed one round of honesty erased a lifetime of cowardice. I went because my grandparents were old and tired and didn't deserve another family scene. I went because some part of me wanted to see with my own eyes what this mess had become. And, if I'm being brutally honest, I went because I wanted proof that my parents' absence would not collapse the sky the way they always acted like it would. The day of the wedding, I stood in front of my mirror in a dress I had nearly returned twice and thought, this is ridiculous. I'm getting dressed to attend the expensive emotional aftermath of my own childhood, but I did my makeup anyway, lightly, nothing dramatic. I was not trying to arrive looking like revenge. I just wanted to look like a woman who belonged in any room she chose to walk into. The venue was beautiful in that polished, neutral, aggressively tasteful way money tends to produce. Fresh flowers, soft lighting, staff moving around like they had rehearsed breathing. My grandparents were already there. My grandmother clutching tissues and trying to pretend it was allergies. A couple of distant aunts showed up. That was basically it from our side. Fewer than 10 people, and half of them looked like they had dressed for joy but packed disappointment in their handbags. My brother's fiancée found me before the ceremony and apologized. Not dramatically, not trying to make us friends. She just said she had judged the situation badly and should have asked more questions sooner. I appreciated that. I also noticed she looked at me with a kind of careful respect after that, which was new and strangely sad because I had never wanted to earn dignity through surviving my family in public. The whole thing felt beautiful and bleak at the same time. You know when something is objectively nice? The flowers are right, the music is soft, the food smells expensive, and yet the air still feels wrong because everybody knows who is missing and why. That. Every smile had a little strain in it. Every photo setup had this invisible blank space where my parents should have been if they had been capable of choosing reality over pride. Before the ceremony started, my brother and I stood off to the side near a closed door while guests settled in. He looked nervous enough to be human for once. Not charming nervous. Not polished. Just a man sweating through his shirt collar because life had finally stopped cushioning him. He thanked me for coming. I said, "Don't make me regret it," which was the closest I had to warmth at the time. He almost laughed. Then he said he was sorry again, quieter than before. I nodded because I didn't know what else to do with it. Walking into that ceremony, as his sister, felt surreal. For years I had built my peace around not being anywhere near him. Now there I was, in heels that hurt, and with my grandmother's compact in my purse, participating in the formal beginning of his marriage, because our parents had chosen martyrdom over attendance. If you had described that to me 5 years earlier, I would have told you to get out of my apartment. Life loves irony when it thinks you need humbling. The ceremony itself was short, thoughtful. The officiant talked about honesty, partnership, and doing the work of choosing each other daily, which almost made me laugh at the timing, but also felt pointed enough that I wondered whether the couple had picked those lines on purpose. My brother's voice shook during his vows. His fiancée's didn't. She sounded grounded in a way I envied. Not soft. Steady. Like somebody who knew love without truth was just theater. At the reception, people did what people always do around family fractures. They pretended not to stare while very obviously tracking the tension. A few of the bride's relatives were kind to me in that extra careful way people get when they know there has been drama and are trying not to step on it. My grandparents stayed until dessert and then left early because my grandfather's back was bothering him. I walked them to their car and my grandmother squeezed my face with both hands and said, "I'm proud of you for staying yourself," which was such a grandmother sentence, and yet it almost undid me. Inside, the room glowed. Music, speeches, clinking glasses, candles. My brother's mother-in-law, now technically something to me, though I try not to over-label people, moved through the room with the serene efficiency of someone used to hosting events that don't involve emotional landmines. I watched my brother thank her and saw genuine humility in him for maybe the first time in my life. Not full transformation. I am not that naive. But a crack, maybe. Enough for some light to get in. Ugh, sorry, that sounded poetic. You know what I mean. He looked less certain that the universe owed him applause. I stayed long enough to be respectable and left before things got too sentimental. In the parking lot, sitting alone in my car with my shoes off and my feet throbbing, I finally let myself feel the weirdness of it. Not closure. Definitely not healing in some neat made-for-television bow. More like confirmation. Proof that the family story my parents had always pushed was not the only available version. They had made themselves absent, they had made themselves tragic, and the world stubbornly kept spinning without casting them in the lead role. More than a year passed after that. My brother became a father. He and his wife named their son after our paternal grandfather instead of our father, which said a lot without needing a speech. My parents never reached out. Not to congratulate him, not to ask about the baby, not to me either. No dramatic apology, no midnight reckoning, just silence, which in some ways was the purest form of them. If they could not be admired, they preferred to be mourned, and if they could not be mourned properly, they vanished. My grandparents became active great-grandparents with the kind of joy that made me happy and furious at the same time. Happy because they adored that baby. Furious because watching them coo over him in ordinary, gentle ways made it even clearer how little tenderness had existed in my own house growing up. I visited often enough that my nephew started reaching for me before he could say my name properly. The first time he toddled toward me with both hands out, I had to blink fast and look at the wall for a second. I am not great at receiving uncomplicated affection. Working on it. My relationship with my brother settled into something careful, cordial, functional, better than before, nowhere near innocent. We talked about practical things, diaper blowouts, sleep schedules, which side of town had the better pediatric clinic. We did not sit around unpacking childhood every weekend. There are some wounds that get cleaner with distance, not repeated handling. Every now and then he would say something that showed he really had started rethinking the past. And I would feel this confusing mix of satisfaction and grief. Satisfaction because finally, obviously. Grief because recognition after the damage is done is still late. I also noticed things I hated noticing. How easy warmth came from his wife's family. The way they included him in little rituals without making him audition for belonging. Sunday dinners. Group texts about birthdays. Extra folding chairs appearing without anybody turning it into a sacrifice. It irritated me in that petty, ugly way because part of me wanted to say, where was all this when I was begging life to be less sharp? But another part of me understood that envy was not about wanting their exact family. It was about finally seeing a version of ordinary care and realizing how radical it had always been. Sometimes people ask if I miss my parents. I miss the idea of having parents. I miss the version of them I kept trying to manufacture out of scraps. I miss what their love might have looked like if it had not always come with conditions, roles, and rankings. But them, specifically? The actual two people who kept choosing pride over honesty? No. What hurts is not losing them. What hurts is understanding, over and over, that a lot of what I thought was love was performance with decent timing. The older my nephew got, the stranger my own history started to feel in my body. Babies do that, I think. They expose things. You hold this tiny person who drools on your shirt and kicks one sock off with the determination of a tiny drunk man, and suddenly your whole nervous system starts asking questions you were not planning to answer before lunch. Like, how hard would it really have been for someone to choose softness with me more often? Like, why did basic care always feel like a prize to be earned in my house instead of a starting point? Like, why was I 40 different kinds of prepared for disappointment by the time I was 12? I never became especially close to my brother again, and I want to be clear about that because people love a redemption arc way more than reality usually supports. We were not suddenly best friends. We did not call each other every night. We did not tearfully rebuild from the ground up while inspirational music played somewhere off-screen. He was still him. I was still me. We had a history full of splinters. But we did reach this awkward adult understanding where we could exist in the same room without pretending the past had been fine. And honestly, that was more than I once thought possible. There were setbacks. Of course there were. One time, about 6 months after the baby was born, he casually joked that I was still kind of scary when I'm mad, and I looked at him so hard he went pale. Because there it was. The old family reflex. Reduce my anger to a personality flaw instead of asking what caused it? He apologized quickly, said he had not meant it that way. Maybe he hadn't. But intent is such a convenient little pillow people like to hide behind after they've thrown something sharp at you. I told him if he wanted this fragile version of a sibling relationship to continue, he needed to stop reaching for old scripts when he got uncomfortable. He said, okay. Then, to his credit, he actually listened. My own life kept moving in the non-cinematic way lives do. Work stayed busy. I got one promotion and turned down another because I finally learned that more money is not always worth becoming a haunted shell with excellent email response times. I started dating a man from another department for a while, then ended it when I realized he was attracted to the idea of me being low maintenance, which is a phrase men should really stop using unless they want women to hear, I'm looking for someone who won't have needs. I took a weekend trip alone. I bought better pillows. I unfollowed a bunch of relatives from a social media app because even seeing their vacation photos annoyed me on principle. Healing is glamorous stuff. Every now and then one of my parents' flying monkeys would resurface. A text from a cousin saying my mother still cried over the family breakdown. A message from an aunt hinting that life was short and maybe I should reconsider reconciliation. Nobody ever came to me with specifics, interestingly. Nobody said, your father admitted he was wrong. Your mother wants to talk honestly. It was always vague, emotional pressure without accountability attached. The family version of recycling old air. I ignored it. Then my grandfather got sick for a while. Not catastrophic, thankfully, but enough to scare all of us. Hospital stay. Medication changes. Long afternoons in waiting rooms that smell like sanitizer and stale coffee. During that time, the topic of my parents came up more than once because stress has a way of dragging every unresolved thing to the surface. My grandmother, who had protected them with silence for most of my life, finally admitted she regretted not interfering more when I was younger. She said she kept telling herself it wasn't her place to challenge how they raised their children. Then she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said sometimes not interfering is just cowardice dressed up as respect. That wrecked me more than any dramatic apology could have, because it was true. And because hearing an older woman say it so plainly felt like somebody finally naming a law I had been living under without consent. It also made me rethink my own role in my nephew's life. I could not be the fun aunt who noticed things and stayed quiet because speaking up felt awkward. If I was going to stay in his world, I wanted to show up honestly, not harshly, not hovering, just honestly. So when my brother and his wife started drifting into some uneven patterns after the baby, mostly around emotional labor and whose career mattered more on hard weeks, I did not pretend not to see. I did not stage an intervention either. Again, real life. But when my brother complained to me once that his wife was always tense now, I told him maybe she was exhausted from carrying the invisible half of parenting, while also trying not to become the household manager of a grown man. He got defensive. Then he got quiet. Then, a few days later, he texted me and said he had been a jerk and had booked the pediatric appointment himself. Tiny step. Still counts. That is the thing about family damage. It reproduces if nobody interrupts it. Not always in giant, obvious ways, sometimes in small, lazy assumptions. In who gets thanked, in who gets heard, in whose dreams are treated like the default setting and whose are treated like optional accessories. I had lived my whole life inside those patterns. Seeing them start to repeat one generation down made my skin crawl. My parents, meanwhile, stayed ghosts by choice. I found out through a relative that they had started telling people they were giving the children space because they refused to be disrespected further. Which, wow. Even their absence had to come with self-praise. Apparently, they had also complained that my brother's wife's family turned him against them, as if he had no agency and no memory of his own. They blamed me too, naturally. I was still the difficult daughter, the cold one, the one who had always thought she was better. Funny how they never promoted me to saint no matter how much responsibility I carried. But let me say no once, and suddenly I had the power to destroy dynasties. Sometimes I wonder if they really believe their own version, or if belief stopped mattering years ago and what they actually need is the performance. Maybe those are the same thing after long enough. Maybe if you repeat a lie inside a family for enough holidays, it starts furnishing the place. I used to fantasize about some final confrontation where I would say every perfect thing and they would have to hear it. I don't anymore. Not because I became wiser than rage. I still have rage. Plenty. But because I finally understood something annoying and freeing. People who protect their delusions that hard are not waiting for your evidence. They are waiting for your participation. They need you inside the play. They need your tears, your defenses, your willingness to argue on their stage so they can keep casting themselves as misunderstood. Leaving the theater is less satisfying than a speech, but it does save time. A little after that, I bought a place of my own, not a mansion, not some revenge house with a 2-story foyer and a staircase for dramatic entrances. A small condo with creaky floors, morning light, and a kitchen big enough that I could cook without bruising my hip on every single appliance. The day I got the keys, I stood in the empty living room eating drive-through fries out of the bag and thinking, wow, nobody gets to insult this one at my dinner table. That was my first thought. Not gratitude, not maturity, spite with a mortgage. I invited my brother's family over for the first holiday dinner there because apparently I enjoy emotional challenges disguised as menus. My nephew ran in like he paid the property taxes himself. My brother offered to help in the kitchen without turning it into a heroic event, which I noticed. His wife brought pie and did not let me do that fake hostess thing, where I insist I need no help while quietly drowning. A couple of my close friends came too, because by then I had finally learned that the people who make a table feel safe are not always the ones who share your blood. Sometimes they are just the ones who show up on time, bring extra ice, and don't rewrite your life when you leave the room. Dinner was loud and imperfect and ordinary. Somebody spilled cider. My nephew dropped a roll and blamed gravity like he was presenting legal defense. He asked 3 personal questions in under 10 minutes about why I didn't have a dog, whether my job was boring, and if adults ever got to eat dessert first, then wandered off to investigate my bookshelves. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. At one point, I looked around the room and felt this strange pressure behind my ribs. Not sadness, not happiness either. Something fuller and harder to name. Because nobody there was performing family. Nobody was keeping score. Nobody needed me to be the easy one so they could stay comfortable. I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't bracing. I was just in my home, with people who knew the ugly version too, and still passed me the potatoes like that was enough information. A week later, I was putting away some recipe cards from my grandmother's box when I found one I had somehow missed. It wasn't a recipe, just her handwriting on a blank index card. It said, "Make your own table and bless it." I sat down on my kitchen floor and cried so hard I scared myself a little. Because that was what I had done, even before I had words for it. So no, the scar never disappeared. There are still days when a certain tone of voice can drag me straight back to that old house. There are still moments when I hear somebody praise a son for the bare minimum, and my whole body tenses before my brain catches up. There are still holidays when I think about what it might have been like to grow up in a family where love didn't need a favorite child to orbit around. But that grief doesn't run the place anymore. My parents are still out there somewhere, probably explaining themselves badly to anyone willing to listen. My brother is still trying. My nephew is loud in the healthiest way and still thinks dinosaur pajamas count as formal wear. I still get angry. I still overwork when I'm stressed and clean my kitchen like I'm trying to scrub a memory off the counters. But I also have a home, boundaries, people who show up honestly, and enough self-respect now to know that being unloved correctly by the wrong people doesn't make me hard to love. It just made me harder to fool. And honestly, after everything, I can live with that. My fiancé left his son with me for 7 days to help his ex, who was going through severe emotional problems, but it cost me my marriage. The day he lined up little orange pill bottles across my kitchen counter like he was setting out party favors, I still thought I was about to marry a decent man. Not a perfect one, obviously. I'm not 12. He was divorced, tired, a little conflict allergic, and way too good at saying things like, "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be," when what he really meant was, "Let's make this easier for me." But I loved him. And worse than that, I had built real routines around loving him. His son's medication alarms were saved in my phone. There was a spare set of dinosaur pajamas in my dryer because the boy always dripped toothpaste down the front when he stayed over. I knew which cartoon could calm him down after a rough day, and which snack he'd suddenly hate because a texture offended him for reasons known only to children, and whichever higher power assigns them personalities. I knew how to count the seconds during a seizure scare without letting my voice shake. That part matters, because 6 months earlier, when his son got diagnosed with epilepsy, all of us had closed ranks around that kid like the diagnosis had snapped us into one shape. Him, his ex-wife, the boy's grandparents. The boys. Me. It felt messy sometimes, but it also felt real. Like the inconvenient real that grown-up love comes with. My name is Corinne, and at that point I was 2 months into being engaged, 3 years into the relationship, and embarrassingly proud of how mature I thought I was handling the whole blended family thing. I worked as a project coordinator for a small medical billing office, which sounds boring because it is, but it paid my rent on time, kept health insurance in my life, and let me work from home a few days a week. He used to bring me coffee on those mornings and kiss my forehead while I sat there in old pajama shorts trying to make a spreadsheet look less like a hostage situation. He had helped me repaint my apartment when I moved. He remembered dumb little details about me, like the fact that I hate bananas but love banana flavoring, which is a character flaw I'm aware of. Thank you. He could be kind in a steady, domestic way that sneaks up on you. That's probably why I ignored the parts that didn't feel good. His ex-wife was one of those women who never raised her voice, and still somehow managed to act like the room belonged to her. She wasn't cartoon villain evil. She wasn't throwing drinks or sending midnight threats. She just had that polished, exhausting confidence of someone who assumed everyone would adapt around her. If she changed the pickup schedule, it was because it made more sense. If she decided a school event needed to include everybody, it was because that was best for their son. If I looked surprised by a last-minute shift in plans, she'd tilt her head like she was confused why a reasonable adult would need advance notice to exist. The first time she rearranged one of our weekends without asking, he shrugged and told me it was easier to just go with it. The first time she called during our date night and kept him on the phone for 40 minutes over a non-emergency, he mouthed sorry at me while I pushed cold fries around my plate and told myself this was what maturity looked like. The monthly dinners with the three of them, and the boy felt weird at first, then normal, then weird again. Sometimes they would fall into shorthand from their marriage, and I'd sit there smiling with a fork in my hand, feeling like a polite guest at my own future. Still, the wedding was only a few months away. We had looked at a small venue outside the city with cheap string lights and ugly carpeting and somehow made it feel romantic anyway. I had started keeping a note in my phone with possible songs and table ideas. He joked that he was happy to marry a woman who could survive both his mother and his ex-wife. And I laughed because that's what women do when a man turns a warning into a compliment. My own mother thought I was lucky. She liked to say no relationship comes without baggage, which coming from the woman who spent most of my childhood teaching me to make myself smaller in the name of peace was not exactly shocking. My younger brother said he liked my fiancé because he seemed steady. My older sister said marrying a man with a kid meant I'd better get used to never being first. She said it with a smile while stealing fries off my plate, and I smiled back because in my family, if somebody insults you lightly enough, you're supposed to call it honesty and move on. So when he showed up on a Tuesday evening looking pale and distracted and said his ex-wife was having some kind of emotional crisis, I didn't go straight to suspicion. I went straight to logistics. That's my disease. He said it would just be 2 or 3 days, maybe less, and asked if I could keep his son at my place because the boy was calmer with me, and his parents were getting older and couldn't handle the stairs at their house easily. He said his ex-wife needed privacy, needed support, needed him there because she was falling apart and didn't want other people involved yet. He said all of this while unscrewing caps and pointing at labels and writing times on sticky notes like he was preparing a substitute teacher. At some point, I asked where exactly he was going to be and how I was supposed to reach him if something happened. He looked away for half a second, which on him was a flare gun. Then he said he'd have his phone, just not constantly, because the situation was delicate. Delicate. Men love a vague word when they're about to dump an actual problem in your lap. I should tell you I almost said no. Not because of the boy. Never because of him. I almost said no because something inside me tightened. Not a dramatic movie feeling. More like that annoying little internal cough of instinct you spend years learning to ignore because otherwise you'd never date anybody. But then his son came in carrying the stuffed shark he slept with at our place, and my fiancé kissed my cheek and thanked me like I was saving the world instead of agreeing to a few extra school nights. And I did what I always did when a situation felt off, and I wanted to be loved more than I wanted to be right. I swallowed it. The first night was fine. We did homework at my kitchen table. I made pasta with butter because that was one of the 3 foods he trusted consistently that month. We reviewed the seizure plan again before bed. He asked if his dad would be back before the weekend, and I said probably, because that was what I had been told. He nodded like kids do when they sense adults are bluffing and don't have the energy to challenge it. After he fell asleep in the second bedroom, I stood in the doorway longer than necessary and watched his little chest move under the blanket. Not because I was being sentimental, because I was suddenly aware that if anything happened, I was the grown-up in charge. By the second day, I was running my work calls with one ear on cartoon theme songs and the other on the medication alarms. My boss was already irritated because we had a hospital account audit coming up, and I had told her I might need a little flexibility for a family emergency without getting into details. Family emergency. That phrase looked ridiculous on my screen when I typed it, because technically it wasn't my family, except it was, until it wasn't. The third day, I missed part of a planning call because the school nurse called to clarify one of his medications, and then his teacher sent a message about a permission slip I had never seen. I texted my fiancé 3 times in one afternoon, once asking if he could call the school because they wanted confirmation about pickup permissions, once asking how his ex-wife was doing, once asking more directly when he was coming back. He answered after dinner with 3 short messages that somehow made me feel like I was bothering him. He said things were still rough. He said thanks again for handling things. He said he'd explain later. Explain what later exactly? That part I didn't ask because if you've ever dated somebody who avoids conflict for sport, you know how quickly you can end up doing half the avoidance for them. By the 5th day, the sticky note schedule on my counter had coffee rings on it. My apartment looked like a toy store had been robbed in a hurry, and I had started sleeping lightly enough that every creak of the building made me sit up. His son had a small episode that wasn't a full seizure, but was close enough to send adrenaline through my whole body. He got glassy-eyed for a second while we were brushing teeth, and I walked him to the couch and talked in the calm voice I had practiced even while my own heart was trying to claw out of my ribs. He was okay. That's the important part. He was okay. But after he fell asleep, I went into my bathroom, shut the door, and cried sitting on the edge of the tub with one hand over my mouth because I was scared and furious and too embarrassed to admit either one out loud. The next morning, my boss called me instead of emailing, which is never a good sign. She asked, in that crisp professional voice people use when they want credit for not sounding cruel, whether I was still committed to leading the project I'd been assigned. I said yes immediately, too quickly, like a liar. She reminded me that the team needed reliability right now. Reliability. I almost laughed. I had become the emergency contact for a child who wasn't mine because a grown man wanted to manage my reaction to something I still didn't understand, and somehow I was the one being warned about reliability. I tried again that afternoon. I called him during my lunch break while his son sat next to me eating crackers and watching a nature show with all the seriousness of a tiny retired man. He didn't pick up. I called again after bedtime, straight to voicemail. Then, at almost 11, he sent a message that just said, "Sorry. Long day. Talk tomorrow. No explanation. No details. No actual tomorrow." A week in, I woke up at 4 because I'd forgotten to switch off an old alarm and my body thought I was late for medicine. The apartment was dark and too quiet, and there's a special kind of loneliness that comes from being exhausted in somebody else's crisis. I lay there staring at the ceiling, counting backwards from 10 the way the neurologist had taught us to stay calm during a flare-up, and realized I no longer knew when this arrangement was supposed to end. I also realized, in a way that made me feel physically sick, that I still did not know where he was. The stupid thing is that I defended him even inside my own head. Maybe it's worse than it sounds. Maybe the ex-wife really is falling apart. Maybe he's sleeping on a couch in some relative's house and barely holding things together. Maybe I'm being selfish for wanting details while somebody else is in pain. Women can build a whole prison out of maybes. I was practically laying bricks by then. 3 days later, on Thursday afternoon, everything blew open. His son was in the living room building a lopsided fort out of couch cushions, and I was on my laptop pretending to care about a spreadsheet nobody was going to thank me for. I opened a social media app because my brain needed a break, and there it was. A cluster of photos posted by one of his friends, all sunburned smiles and bright drinks and that aggressively cheerful light you only get in tropical places. I recognized his face before my mind even caught up to what I was seeing. He was standing in the middle of a group on a beach, grinning with one arm slung around some friend from college, wearing the shirt I bought him last fall because he said it made his shoulders look less tired. In the next photo, his ex-wife was next to him, holding up her left hand. Ring. Huge ring. The caption was something gushy about love, fresh starts, and saying yes in paradise. I stared so long my eyes started watering. I checked the date. It had been posted that day. I clicked through the rest with that cold, floating feeling people always describe right before they pass out or throw up. Sunset dinner, poolside drinks, group selfie. Him in the background of one video laughing while somebody shouted congratulations. There was no crisis, no emergency, no private emotional breakdown. He was on vacation. He had left his sick child with me under false pretenses so he could go celebrate his ex-wife getting engaged. I wish I could say my first reaction was anger, because anger is cleaner. It would make me sound less humiliatingly sincere. My first reaction was confusion so complete it almost felt like stupidity. I genuinely tried to make it make sense. Maybe the photos were old. Maybe the caption was a joke. Maybe there was some explanation where I wasn't being treated like free childcare by a man I was planning to marry. Then his son padded into the kitchen in mismatched socks and asked if he could have the animal crackers with frosting on them. And I heard myself say, "Sure, baby," like nothing in my chest had just been split open. I texted him immediately. Not politely. Not well. I asked where he was. I asked if he was seriously at a beach while I was taking his son to school and giving him medication and missing work. I asked if he had lost his mind. I watched the typing bubble appear and disappear twice before he finally answered with a message so casual I still get hot thinking about it. Calm down. I'll explain when I get back. Please keep him a few more days. A few more days. That was the sentence that broke something, not the beach photo. Not even the lie, if I'm being honest. It was the entitlement of that message, the assumption that I would stay in position, keep performing this labor, absorb the fear and responsibility and humiliation, and wait neatly on a shelf until he returned with whatever explanation he thought would get him through the door. I spent the next hour moving around my apartment like a person who had forgotten how furniture worked. I picked up my phone, put it down, opened the fridge, shut it again, checked the medication schedule, looked at the boy, looked away. He was on the rug with his stuffed shark, humming to himself, and every possible option felt ugly. Keep him there and wait for a man who had already shown me exactly what I was to him. Hand him off to somebody without proper medical instructions. Pretend I could do this indefinitely. I tried calling my fiancé twice. No answer. I searched my old messages for his parents' numbers and realized every time plans had been made before, they had gone through him. Of course they had. Control freaks don't always look controlling. Sometimes they just make sure every road goes through them. I called again. Straight to voicemail. Then I did the thing I still hate admitting out loud. I called the county non-emergency line because I didn't know what else to do, and because fear had finally beaten shame. My voice was shaking so badly, the woman on the phone asked me twice to repeat myself. I told her I had been left caring for a 7-year-old child with epilepsy under false pretenses, that I did not have legal guardianship, that the father was out of town and refusing to return, and that I was scared of what would happen if there was a medical emergency. Even as I said it, part of me was horrified. I sounded dramatic. Hysterical. Like every stereotype women get handed the second they stop being convenient. But then the boy's 6 o'clock alarm went off from my phone and I had to pause the call to give him medicine with my free hand, and the woman on the line went very quiet in a way that told me I wasn't overreacting nearly as much as I'd been told my whole life. 2 officers came first, then a caseworker. Nobody stormed in. Nobody treated me like I was a criminal mastermind ruining lives for fun. They asked questions. I showed them the messages and the photos and the pill bottles lined up on my counter like evidence from the world's saddest scavenger hunt. The caseworker spoke to me in a steady, matter-of-fact tone that made me feel both relieved and more ashamed somehow. She asked whether there were grandparents, an aunt, anybody local. I said yes, his parents, but I didn't have their number. She made a call, then another. Everything took longer than I thought it would. The boy got scared when strangers started using soft voices around him. He asked where his dad was. He asked if he had done something wrong. That part will probably live under my skin forever. When his grandparents finally arrived, the grandfather looked stunned and angry in that stiff old man way, where the anger is mostly at reality for requiring emotion in public. The grandmother was the one who knelt down and opened her arms. The boy went to her fast, but he kept looking back at me like I might explain the plot. I couldn't. I helped pack his bag because apparently that is the kind of punishment life invents when it feels creative. I folded dinosaur pajamas with my hands shaking. I tucked in the stuffed shark. I wrote down the medication times even though they already knew them because suddenly not doing something with my hands felt impossible. Right before he left, he asked if he was still coming back to my apartment after the weekend. I said, "I don't know, sweetheart." And then I had to turn away because my face had stopped cooperating. The second the door shut behind them, the apartment went silent in this brutal, unnatural way. There were toy cars under my coffee table and a half-finished drawing on the couch and a little cup in the sink with cartoon fish on it. And I stood there in the middle of all of it, feeling like the worst person alive. Then my phone started ringing. He was screaming before I even got hello out. Not raised voice upset, full yelling. He demanded to know what I had done. He said I had traumatized his son. He said I had humiliated him in front of his parents. He said, "How could you?" And that was the moment whatever was left of my restraint just burst like a cheap pipe. I shouted right back. I told him he had lied to me, used me, dumped medical responsibility for his child on me, and flown off to celebrate another woman's engagement while I rearranged my life around his mess. I told him I had spent a week terrified of a seizure happening while he sipped drinks on a beach. He kept saying it wasn't like that, and I kept saying then, what exactly was it like? Because from where I was standing it looked an awful lot like cowardice with good lighting. He tried to come back to the line about his son being innocent. And I remember saying, yes, he is, which is why his father should have acted like a father instead of a teenager avoiding a hard conversation. I was so angry I was shaking. He was too. There was nothing tidy about it. No smart final line. I just hung up when he started talking over me again, then blocked his number before I could lose my nerve. The next morning, I called in sick, which I almost never did because I had been raised by the kind of mother who thinks pneumonia is a scheduling issue. Then I started packing his things. Not in one dramatic sweep with music playing in the background. Just one stupid item at a time. His sneakers by the door. The hoodie he kept forgetting on my couch. His charger from my bedroom. The razor he left by my sink. Tiny domestic leftovers of a man who had managed to make himself feel like family in the quiet spaces of my life. Halfway through, I found one of the boys' toy cars under the couch and sat down hard on the floor because my legs went weak. I held that little plastic thing in my palm and cried so hard I gave myself a headache. By late afternoon, I had stacked his boxes in the hallway outside my apartment door because I didn't trust myself not to throw something if he came inside. He showed up just after dark. I knew it was him from the knock. Funny how quickly somebody's knock can turn from comfort to threat. I didn't open the door. I stood on the other side, barefoot, gripping the lock like that did anything, while he said my name in the exhausted voice men use when they've decided you're being emotional and they're the victim of your tone. He said it wasn't what it looked like. He said the trip had been planned around a mutual friend proposing to his ex-wife. He said he knew I'd be upset about him going away with her and the group, especially with their son not going, and he panicked. He thought if he told me the truth beforehand, I'd turn it into a fight. So he lied. That was his explanation. Not that he had no choice. Not that somebody's life was at stake. He just wanted to avoid a difficult conversation and decided I could absorb the fallout later. Standing there with the door between us, I started remembering a dozen little moments I had filed away under not worth it. The times he canceled plans after she called. The times decisions about the boys' school, doctor visits, or schedule were made before I even knew there was a discussion. The way he always wanted credit for peace while somebody else, usually me, paid for it and swallowed feelings. He kept saying he was sorry and that he'd made a mistake and that he hadn't known how to handle it. I remember thinking, no, you handled it exactly the way you always do. You picked the easiest route for yourself and left somebody else to clean up the mess. I opened the door just enough to hold out the ring box. I had put the engagement ring back in it after taking it off that morning, which was harder than I thought it would be and somehow also not hard enough. He looked down at it and then at me like he honestly believed there was still a version of the evening where I let him in and we worked through it over tea, like civilized adults in a counseling brochure. I told him I was done. I told him he didn't get to lie to me about something this serious and then lecture me about trust. He asked if I was really ending our relationship over one stupid decision, and I almost laughed in his face. One stupid decision. Men really will condense an entire character pattern into a single unfortunate event if they think it'll save them. So yes, I gave him the ring. And no, I didn't do it gracefully. My hand was shaking, my face was blotchy. I said you always choose what protects you, and then I shut the door before he could answer, because I knew if I let him keep talking, I'd start doubting my own pulse. The weird thing about ending an engagement is that the dramatic part is short. The humiliating administrative part goes on forever. You still have his name in the Notes app next to wedding ideas. You still have a fitting appointment reminder on your calendar. Your aunt texts, asking if you want the folding card box she used for her daughter's reception, and you have to decide whether to answer honestly or fake your own death. The weekend after I gave the ring back, I canceled the venue visit, the florist consultation, and the little bakery tasting I had been irrationally excited about because they did tiny lemon cakes with blackberry filling. The woman at the bakery was kinder than I deserved. She said, "Oh, honey, I'm sorry," in a voice so gentle it nearly sent me through the floor. Meanwhile, my apartment felt haunted by routine. My phone still tried to remind me about medication times for 2 days before I realized I hadn't deleted the alarms. The first time one went off at bedtime, I bolted upright from the couch and then just sat there listening to it ring until it stopped. I kept passing the second bedroom and expecting to hear cartoon sound effects, or the thump of little feet jumping off the mattress after I had specifically said no jumping. I found one of his socks in the laundry 3 days later and stood in my hallway holding it like I had uncovered evidence of a civilization that no longer existed. I also, because apparently humiliation likes company, had to keep going to work. The Monday after everything blew up, I went into the office because hiding at home with my thoughts felt medically unwise. My boss took one look at my face and asked if I was sick. I said no, just tired, which was technically true if you ignore the emotional crater. Work had already suffered. I had missed deadlines, handed off tasks badly, and sent at least one email with the wrong attachment because my brain had been split between claim codes and pediatric medication. I spent the entire morning overcorrecting like a woman auditioning for reliability. By lunch, I had a tension headache so sharp I could feel it in my teeth. Then my mother called. You can probably guess how that went if you've ever had a mother who mistakes endurance for virtue. She had heard from my sister that the engagement was off. My sister had heard from my brother, and my brother had heard from me in the watered-down version I gave him because I still had some dignity left and was trying to preserve it like jam in a panic. My mother asked what happened in the tone people use when they already have a theory and are just waiting for you to confirm it. I told her the short version. He lied. He left his son with me under false pretenses. I found out he was on vacation. I ended it. There was a pause on the line, and then she said, "Well, you didn't have to overreact with the authorities. I nearly dropped my sandwich," she went on, calm as a weather report, about how men make mistakes, how blended families are complicated, how sick children need stability, how maybe I should have waited for him to get back instead of escalating things. Escalating. That word again. As if I had launched a missile instead of calling for help because I had no legal standing, no guardian paperwork, and no honest timeline from the child's father. I said, maybe louder than I needed to, that her definition of overreacting was always suspiciously close to a woman having boundaries. She got offended, naturally. My mother can walk into a room full of broken glass and somehow end up hurt that somebody raised their voice near her. By the end of the call, she was sighing about how I always make everything harder. I hung up first, which in my family counts as a revolutionary act. My sister was worse because she wrapped cruelty in practicality. She texted, "You were right to leave him, but calling outsiders about the kid was messy." Messy. I stared at that word for a solid minute, as if there had been a neat version of what happened, as if my choices had been keep the child indefinitely with no information, magically summon the grandparents from thin air, or accept being told I should protect everybody else's comfort while mine burned. I didn't answer her. Not because I was taking the high road, because if I had answered, it would have been with something I couldn't take back, and I was already tired of being the designated unstable woman in every story. The messages from his people started after that, not all at once, drip by drip. One of his friends saying he knew things looked bad but there had been a misunderstanding. Another saying the boy was upset and asking for me, which was a cruel thing to tell me and also, I suspect, not entirely accidental. One of the wives in that social group told me I should think about what kind of trauma I had caused by involving strangers when the child was already dealing with a medical condition. I read that one sitting in my car outside a grocery store and laughed so suddenly a man loading bottled water into his trunk looked concerned. Trauma. That word from them. As if his father abandoning him with me under a lie didn't count because it was done politely. Still, the guilt got me where the judgment couldn't. Every time somebody mentioned the boy asking for me, something inside me folded. I knew he had been frightened. I knew he didn't understand why adults he trusted had started acting like the floor was unstable. My anger at his father did not cancel that out. That's the awful part about being right in a situation where a child gets hurt. There's no victory in it. You don't get your instincts validated and then suddenly feel clean. You just get extra grief layered over the first kind. At night, I'd replay the transfer over and over. The look on his face. The way I avoided answering because any answer would have been a lie or a burden no 7-year-old should have to carry. I started leaving the television on until I fell asleep because silence made room for memory in a way I couldn't tolerate. Twice that week, I woke up already reaching for my phone to check medication alarms that no longer existed. Once I actually got out of bed, walked halfway down the hallway, and only stopped when I saw the second bedroom dark and empty. I leaned against the wall and laughed the kind of laugh that sounds like your body has given up on distinguishing between humor and pain. A week and a half later, his ex-wife showed up at my apartment. She arrived in the middle of a Saturday afternoon while I was cleaning out my fridge and throwing away leftovers like a woman trying to regain control of 1 square foot of existence. When I opened the door and saw her standing there in nice jeans and that composed face, I almost closed it immediately. Instead, I froze, which I hate about myself. She said she wanted to talk. I said I didn't. She said it would just take a minute. That was a lie, obviously. People who say just a minute are the same people who borrow emotional space like they're entitled to the lease. So she came in, because I was caught off guard and because some terrible piece of my upbringing still thinks being rude is a worse sin than being invaded. She looked around my living room like she was trying to assess damage after a storm. Then she sat on the edge of my couch and thanked me for helping with her son during a difficult week. I actually blinked at her. The nerve of it. Thanked me. Like this was a delayed thank you note after a bake sale. She apologized first, sort of. She said if she had known he lied about why he was going, she never would have let things play out the way they did, which sounded generous until I noticed she never actually apologized for calling him away, never apologized for the situation itself, never apologized for the fact that the people around them had apparently all known more than I did. Then the real reason she was there slipped out. She said he was devastated. She said he wasn't sleeping. She said he loved me and had made a stupid decision out of fear. She said maybe, for the sake of the boy, I could at least talk to him again. There it was. Not concern for me. Not concern for boundaries. Damage control. She had come to my apartment to help manage a man's emotional consequences with the same brisk competence she probably brought to school forms and holiday logistics. I asked if she was seriously there to ask me to take him back. She said not exactly, then immediately started explaining why I should consider it. She said families are complicated. She said co-parenting sometimes creates weird gray areas. She said he'd been trying to spare my feelings. I'm sorry, but if a woman tells me a man lied to spare my feelings, I'm going to hear I personally recycle gaslighting and call it empathy. I told her to leave, calmly at first. She stayed seated. She said I was being unfair. She said all of us had been trying to keep things stable for the boy. All of us. That phrase hit me harder than it probably should have because it revealed what I had started suspecting the second I saw those beach photos. I wasn't inside their family system. I was adjacent to it, useful to it, welcomed when convenient, expected to bend when necessary, but never truly given the same courtesy as the people who had history before me. I told her again to leave. She stood up but kept talking, which honestly might be my least favorite adult behavior after lying. When somebody is already in motion toward the door and still treating your threshold like a debate stage. She said I had overreacted. She said the call I made had consequences for her son. She said if I really loved him, I would try to repair the rupture instead of adding to it. That was when I stopped caring about politeness altogether. I stepped toward the door, opened it, and said, "Get out." She kept arguing, not yelling. Somehow the composed version was worse. Then she put one hand on the door frame like she was grounding herself there, and I took her by the upper arm and pushed her firmly outside. Not a punch. Not a dramatic shove down the hallway. Just enough force to move a woman who was refusing to leave my home. She stumbled back a step, looked shocked, and I shut the door in her face so hard a picture frame rattled in the hallway. Afterward, I stood there shaking so badly I had to sit on the floor. I wasn't proud of touching her. I also wasn't sorry I made her leave. Both things can be true. That's another adult lesson nobody puts on greeting cards. He called from a different number that evening. I answered because I thought it might be work. Rookie mistake. The second I heard his voice, every muscle in my back locked. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask if I was okay. He opened with, "Did you put your hands on her?" I was honestly impressed by the speed. That man could sprint straight past the original betrayal and arrive at my reaction before most people finished saying hello. I told him she had refused to leave my apartment. He said she had gone there trying to help. I said help whom? He ignored that. He started talking about how his son was confused and upset, how his parents were furious, how people were asking questions, how this entire situation had spun out of control because I'd made everything public. Public. Again, amazing. A week on a beach with a group of friends who knew I was home medicating? His kid apparently didn't count as public. My call for help did. Somewhere in the middle of his speech, I realized he was not trying to repair anything. He was trying to establish a version. In his version, he was a flawed but loving father who made one panicked mistake. His ex-wife was a peacekeeping co-parent, and I was the unstable fiancé who overreacted. Involved officials, put hands on a woman, and blew up a family over jealousy. Once I heard the structure of it, I couldn't unhear it. The careful emphasis on my tone, my call, my push at the doorway. Nothing about the original lie except as context for my behavior. Everything about narrative management. I told him if he kept contacting me after I asked him not to, I would speak to an attorney about harassment. I didn't actually have one lined up. I had a legal plan about as developed as a wet napkin, but the word attorney works on certain men the way a spray bottle works on cats. He went quiet for a second, then said I was being dramatic. I said maybe, but don't call again. Then I blocked that number too. Over the next few weeks, I built a whole little routine out of surviving embarrassment. Wake up too early, stare at the ceiling, go to work, pretend to care about insurance appeals, eat dinner over my sink like a raccoon, ignore messages from people who suddenly felt qualified to grade my behavior under pressure. Repeat. I stopped answering unknown numbers. I muted my family group chat because my sister kept sending vague little comments about pride and consequences like she was writing fortune cookies for women she disliked. My brother checked in more gently. He said he thought the whole thing was messed up and that our mother was being unfair, which nearly made me cry because in my family, straightforward support feels like somebody handed you $1 million and a safe place to sleep. One Tuesday after work, I sat in my car outside my apartment for almost 40 minutes because I didn't want to go in. The quiet of that place had changed. Before, it used to feel peaceful in the adult way. Bills paid. Dishes done. Bra off. Good night. After everything, the quiet felt like absence with utilities. I finally went upstairs, opened the door, and found a folded drawing paper under my doormat. No note. Just a child's drawing in thick marker. 3 figures holding hands. One taller, one medium, one small. The small one had a shark in the other hand. I sat right there in the hallway and started crying before I even made it to the signature, which was a scribble version of the boy's name I had seen on school papers a dozen times. I never found out who left it. One of the grandparents, maybe. Maybe his father had done one decent thing in the middle of all this and passed it along. Maybe the boy himself had insisted. I don't know. What I do know is that I shoved that drawing in my kitchen junk drawer because seeing it felt like being peeled. I couldn't throw it away, and I couldn't leave it out. That ended up describing a lot of my emotional landscape. By the second month, some of the noise died down. That's the thing about other people's opinions. They feel like weather when you're inside them. Then one day you realize most of those people have moved on to somebody else's mess. Work got easier because I had no choice. I took on extra hours, partly because I needed to repair my reputation with my boss, and partly because being useful at something concrete felt better than sitting in my apartment, conducting little private trials where I was both defendant and hostile witness. I got through the hospital audit. I fixed a billing error nobody else had caught. My boss started using her normal tone with me again, which I'm pretty sure is corporate language for congratulations on resuming personhood. The guilt didn't let up, though. Not really. I'd be in the grocery store and instinctively reach for the brandless fruit snacks he liked, then stand there with the box in my hand feeling idiotic. I'd hear a kid in the next apartment laughing and feel my body go alert before my brain caught up. Once I drove past his school by accident because I was distracted, and seeing the little line of children at pickup time made me have to pull into a pharmacy parking lot to stop shaking. There are some losses you can dramatize cleanly. Fiancé lies, woman leaves, end scene. Losing a child who was never legally yours but had started living in your nervous system is uglier and harder to explain. My mother remained deeply committed to proving that even my heartbreak could become a lesson about my temperament. She invited me to dinner one Sunday and managed, within 20 minutes, to suggest that if I had been more flexible from the start, maybe the ex-wife wouldn't have seen me as a threat, and maybe the man I almost married wouldn't have felt he needed to hide things. Imagine hearing that with mashed potatoes in your mouth. I put my fork down and stared at her so long she finally asked what. I said really quietly that I had spent my whole life being asked to absorb other people's bad behavior gracefully, and I was done auditioning for sainthood in a family that only respected women when they were swallowing glass silently. My mother started crying, of course. Not because she had hurt me, because I had spoken plainly in a tone she disliked. My sister took her side immediately. She said I was rewriting history because I couldn't handle that I had made a bad situation worse. We got into the kind of kitchen argument that makes every childhood role slide right back into place. She became the sensible one, I became the emotional one, our mother became the wounded referee, and I suddenly felt 15 again, trying to explain why a boundary wasn't the same thing as a tantrum. I left before dessert and turned my phone off for the rest of the night. That was the first time in my adult life I considered that maybe keeping peace with my family had cost me more than losing them ever would. A few days after that, one of the wives from his friend group sent me a longer message than usual. She said she knew things had gotten ugly and didn't expect me to answer, but she wanted me to know the boy was safe with his grandparents part of the week, and with his parents the rest. That should have comforted me. It did a little. Then she added that he asked about me often and still called the second bedroom at my apartment his room. I had to put my phone face down on my desk and go cry in the office bathroom like a 19-year-old intern dumped by a drummer. I replied later with the only honest thing I had. I said I knew I had hurt him. I said that part would stay with me. She wrote back, "He was hurt before you called. Everyone was just pretending otherwise." That sentence sat in my chest for days. Around the same time, I started noticing small cracks in the story his side had been telling. Not enough to vindicate me in some cinematic reveal way. Real life is ruder than that. But little things. One friend who had been frosty suddenly unfollowed both him and his ex-wife. Another stopped replying to the group messages my sister had somehow gained access to through mutual acquaintances, because boundaries are apparently decorative in half the people I know. A woman I'd met twice at barbecues viewed every story I posted for 2 weeks straight, like she was conducting surveillance with anxiety. You can feel a social circle turning even before you know why. It's like hearing drywall shift. Then, on a rainy Thursday night when I was in sweatpants eating cereal for dinner because adulthood had clearly peaked already, I found an unread message buried in requests on that same social media app where I'd first seen the beach photos. It was from a woman in the group. Not a close friend. More like somebody's partner I had exchanged polite patio small talk with 3 times. Her message started with, "I'm sorry to do this over text," which is never how good news begins. She said her boyfriend had told her more than he should have after an argument, and she felt sick keeping it from me. She said what happened on the trip was worse than I knew. She said my ex-fiancé and his ex-wife had been flirting openly the whole week in a way that made several people uncomfortable. She said there was one night, after too many drinks, when they disappeared for a while together and came back separately. She said the boyfriend had admitted there had been talk in the group before the trip too. Little jokes and looks everybody pretended not to notice because nobody wanted to be the person who blew up 2 households and an engagement. I read her message 4 times. My hands went numb in that creepy way where they still function but don't feel connected to you. Then I called her, because some pain deserves a human voice. She answered immediately like she had been waiting. She sounded nervous, guilty, and weirdly relieved. She confirmed everything. No, she hadn't seen them have sex. No, nobody had filmed anything, because thank God these people weren't full demons. But yes, there had been enough behavior that the now former fiancé of the ex-wife had confronted someone in the group. Yes, people had been covering for them. Yes, she had wanted to tell me earlier, but her boyfriend begged her not to get involved. I thanked her, which felt bizarre. Then I hung up and sat very still on my couch with my cereal turning to paste in the bowl beside me. Vindication is such a scam. You think if you're proven right, the whole structure of what hurt you will reorganize into something cleaner. It doesn't. It just adds another room to the ruin. I had been right that the beach photos were not innocent. Right that the lie was bigger than the explanation at my door. Right that their whole little circle had treated me like a replaceable support beam. And none of that changed the boy crying at my door, or the call I made, or the fact that I still missed a child who no longer belonged in my life. I didn't sleep much that night. Around 2 a.m, I did something I had promised myself I wouldn't do anymore, which was reopen old messages and reread them like a detective with no badge and too much mascara history. There were so many little places where the truth had leaked through if I'd been less invested in being chosen. The vague scheduling changes. The times he got defensive when I asked ordinary questions. The weird tenderness he still reserved for his ex-wife when she was upset, even while insisting it was all about co-parenting. Looking back is a mean hobby. It turns you into your own worst commenter. The next day I called the former fiancé of his ex-wife. I had never been close to him. We had met at birthdays and school things and one awkward pumpkin patch trip where half the adults were pretending not to notice weird emotional geometry. But I still had his number from a group thread about a fundraiser for the boys' medical bills months earlier. I stared at it for a long time before calling because I wasn't sure whether I was being brave, petty, or lonely. Probably all 3. He answered on the second ring sounding tired in a deep, lived-in way. I said my name, and he actually let out this short, humorless laugh like he'd been expecting my call since the universe was invented. I told him I had heard some things and didn't want gossip. Just clarity. He was quiet for a second, then said he already knew. He had ended the engagement the week before. Somebody from the trip had confessed enough to make the rest obvious. He didn't give me a dramatic speech. That almost made it worse. He just spoke like a man who had finished being surprised and moved on to inventory. Yes, there had been signs before. Yes, he had ignored them because every sign had a tidy explanation available if you wanted one badly enough. No, he didn't think the trip was the first time they crossed lines, just the first time people stopped pretending not to see it. He said he was sorry for my part in it, then added, kind of grimly, that their son had been used as a bridge for a long time, an excuse for closeness, a reason they could stay entangled without naming what they were doing. That sentence messed me up for days, because it lined up with something I hadn't wanted to admit even to myself. There were moments, small at the time, when I had felt like the boys' needs were being used to force emotional access between adults who hadn't earned it from each other. A doctor's appointment turning into a family lunch I wasn't told about until the last minute. A school event where they stood together laughing while I held the backpack and snacks off to the side like unpaid staff. An emergency pickup that somehow became the 3 of us in a parking lot, discussing weekend plans while the child, the alleged reason for all this blending, sat in the back seat watching cartoons through sticky fingerprints. None of it was criminal. None of it was movie-level dramatic. It was just intimate in a way that denied its own intimacy. I wanted to hate both of them cleanly after that. I really did. Hate is energizing. It gives shape to grief. But what I mostly felt was tired. Tired that I had doubted myself so hard I needed strangers to verify my reality. Tired that a child I loved had become collateral in adult dishonesty. Tired that my own family had looked at the situation and still found a way to ask whether I could have smiled more while being used. A week later, his grandmother called me from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. When I heard her voice, my throat closed up immediately. She said she hoped it was okay that she was calling and that if I wanted her to hang up, she would. I said no. It's okay, which was generous considering I burst into tears 2 sentences later. She didn't apologize for him. That was the first reason I could speak to her at all. She said what happened should not have happened. She said adults had made selfish choices and then acted shocked that there were consequences. She said the boy was doing all right medically and was settling back into routine. Then, very carefully, she said he still asked about me sometimes, but less now. Less now. Those 2 words hit with a kind of mercy I wasn't prepared for. She also said something else I needed, even if it didn't fix anything. She said, "You were scared, and scared people sometimes do the safest thing they can think of, not the prettiest." Coming from her, it felt like somebody finally acknowledged the actual moment instead of the version people had built afterward. I told her I was sorry for how confusing it had been for him. I told her I would always be sorry for that. She said she knew. Then she told me there was no plan to push contact because routine mattered. But she wanted me to know I hadn't been erased from the story in their house. After we hung up, I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet and cried in a way that felt almost clean for once. Not long after that, my mother invited herself over. She arrived with grocery store flowers and a casserole, which in her language means I have decided to resume diplomacy without admitting I was wrong. I let her in because I was tired and because a petty streak can only carry me so far when somebody shows up with hot food. We sat at my table under the ugly overhead light, and for a while we talked about nothing. Work, the weather, my brother changing jobs. Then she finally said she had heard more of the truth from somebody who knew somebody in that friend group. Amazing how facts become more credible once a chain of distant social approval gets stapled to them. She said maybe she had been too hard on me. Maybe. I almost applauded. Then she started crying again and talking about how she only wanted me to be secure, how she worried that I ruined something permanent over pride, how she never wanted me to end up alone because I could be sharp when I was hurt. There it was, the same old family language dressed in concern. I interrupted her, which felt like standing up inside my own skin. I said being alone was not the worst thing that had almost happened to me. Becoming the kind of woman who accepts lying because she's scared of losing a seat at the table was worse. She got very quiet after that. We didn't solve our history in one casserole conversation. Thank God. I don't trust endings that tidy. But something shifted. Maybe because I finally said the quiet part out loud. Maybe because she was old enough now to see some of herself in the men she used to excuse. Maybe because shame had finally become inconvenient for her too. Whatever the reason, she left without telling me to be nicer. That counted. My sister was slower to come around, mostly because she hates being second to any emotional revelation. She sent a text 2 days later saying she still thought I handled some of it badly, but she admitted he was trash. That was the apology. I laughed for a full minute. In some families, growth comes with tears and a hug. In mine, it arrives wearing boots and pretending it was always headed here. By late fall, my lease was up. I decided not to renew, not because the apartment was cursed, but because every corner of it had become a little museum exhibit about almost. The wall where we measured where a bigger sofa could go after the wedding. The kitchen counter where the pill bottles had stood. The second bedroom with the glow-in-the-dark stars still stuck to one patch of ceiling, because the boy had cried when one fell down, and I had promised I'd replace them properly later. Later turned out to be one of those imaginary countries adults keep booking trips to and never visit. So I moved across town to a smaller place above a hair salon where the floors creaked and the water pressure was tragic, but nobody there knew my business. The first night in the new apartment, I ate takeout on the floor and listened to strangers laughing outside, and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not joy. I'm not going to insult you with fake empowerment glitter. It was more like relief without witnesses. A quiet room that belonged only to me. No ex-wife orbit. No child-sized toothbrush in my cup. No door I expected a liar to knock on. I also started therapy, which I had been threatening to do for years like it was a rebellious haircut. My therapist had the patience of a saint and the face of a woman who had heard every variation of, "I'm not usually like this" from people exactly like me. In one of our first sessions, I told her I couldn't stop replaying the call I made, the transfer, the look on the boy's face. I said I knew why I had done it, but knowing wasn't the same as forgiving myself. She asked me what I thought would have happened if I had kept him there indefinitely while waiting for a man who was lying to me. I said I don't know. She said exactly. Safety decisions often feel ugly when made in real time. That didn't erase the guilt, but it gave it less room to cosplay as proof of my evil. She also pointed out something I hated hearing because it was true. She said I had spent a lot of energy asking whether I overreacted in the final moment, and very little asking why I tolerated so many smaller violations before it. That question followed me home like a stray cat. Why had I translated discomfort into maturity? Why had I treated my own unease like a personality flaw to be managed? Why had it felt more natural to doubt myself than the man actively lying to me? Some of those answers had his face. A lot of them had my mother's. Winter came in mean and gray. My brother helped me assemble cheap bookshelves in the new place and didn't ask too many questions when he found me crying over a box labeled bedroom stars. My mother started calling before dropping by, which may not sound impressive unless you know her. My sister and I found a cautious rhythm built mostly out of shared sarcasm and deliberately avoiding the topic of my failed engagement unless one of us had enough wine to be honest. Life didn't improve in a montage. It just got less raw by inches. I heard one final update about them through the same annoying social pipeline that delivers all modern tragedy. He and his ex-wife never officially got back together, at least not in the grand romantic way people post about. That somehow felt perfectly on brand. People like that don't always choose each other cleanly. Sometimes they just keep wrecking the edges of everybody else's life while insisting they're doing their best. Last I heard, they were in the same orbit, still entangled, still explaining themselves differently depending on the audience. I didn't need details after that. Whatever they were, they could be at somewhere far away from my front door. Every now and then, I still think about the boy at odd times, in the grocery store near the cereal aisle, walking past a school playground. When I see those little winter gloves clipped to jackets with the world's tiniest plastic clasps. Grief is embarrassing like that. It doesn't arrive with violins. It shows up when you're buying dish soap. I keep the drawing he left under my doormat in a folder with important papers, which is objectively unhinged but less depressing than keeping it in a shrine-like drawer. Once in a while, I take it out, look at the 3 figures holding hands, and put it back before I can invent a future that was never actually mine. The last time he tried to contact me was almost a year after the beach trip. An email, 3 lines long, sent late at night from an address I didn't recognize until I saw the signature. He said he hoped I was doing well. He said he knew he had hurt me. He said he still thought about the life we almost had. I read it once, then twice, mostly out of anthropological interest. There was still no real accountability in it. No sentence that fully named what he had done. No acknowledgement that his son had paid for his cowardice too. Just that same soft-focus regret men sometimes use when they want to revisit the feeling of being loved without standing in the full light of why they lost it. I deleted it. That might be the least dramatic choice I made in the whole story, but it's the one I'm proudest of. Not because it made me feel powerful. Honestly, I felt kind of sick afterward. Closing a door for real is quieter than people tell you. No music, no speech, just your hand moving and the room staying exactly as it was. But I was done turning my pain into a discussion forum for people who had already shown me how little clarity mattered to them. These days, my life is smaller than the one I thought I was building, but it fits better. I work, I pay my bills, I call my brother back. I sometimes let my mother annoy me in manageable doses. And I have gotten very good at leaving the second a situation starts asking me to betray myself politely. I'm not healed in the glossy way people post about. I still have a nasty reflex for self-doubt. I still wonder whether there was any version of that week where the child at the center of it all came out untouched. Probably not. That's the answer I hate and trust at the same time. But I also know this now. Loving a child does not obligate you to stay available for the adults using him to hold your place. Being understanding is not the same thing as being lied to quietly. And sometimes the choice that leaves the ugliest bruise on your conscience is still the one that keeps you from disappearing inside somebody else's mess. I wish I could tie it up nicer than that. I wish I could say everybody learned something beautiful and grew in a straight line, and now I never wake up angry or guilty or suddenly sad because a cartoon shark in a store bin catches my eye. That would be easier. It would also be a lie, and I've had enough of those to last the rest of my life. So no, I didn't get the wedding. I didn't get the little family I thought I was earning through patience and compromise and all the mature language women use when we're secretly begging reality to reward us for being low maintenance. What I got was uglier and more useful. I learned what it feels like when your own instincts are trying to save you and you keep asking them to lower their voice. I learned that some people confuse access with entitlement. I learned that love can be real and still not be safe. And I learned, very late but not too late, that I would rather be the difficult woman in somebody else's story than the easy woman disappearing inside it.